This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning and welcome to the May meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee here in the Chamber at City Hall. We're very pleased to have a series of important guests, experts who are going to talk to us shortly about trees, which is the main topic that we'll be discussing this morning. However, before we get to that part of the agenda, we've got some business to be gone through. When we do get there, we'll be talking about the plans that the Mayor has and other stakeholders have in place to adapt trees and tree planting and tree care strategies as we move further and further into this world with a very changed climate. However, I'm going to do the housekeeping tasks, the first one of which is, can I just remind everybody who has a phone, which is the entire world, can you please put it on silent or on vibrate and don't leave it in front of the microphone. And if you can, when you're speaking into the microphone, if you can adjust it so that we can hear you clearly. If you do need to move it closer, don't pick it up by its neck. Please pick it up by the base, not the gooseneck, because they will otherwise fall apart, and we will have to charge you. No, we won't. But we would rather you didn't break the microphones, if you don't mind. We have already trailed the fact that we're having this meeting on social media. We've trailed it on X, Threads, Instagram, probably Facebook, I think also Blue Sky, everywhere in the world. If you want to talk about it on social media, if you can use at London Assembly on X and use the hashtag Assembly Environment on all media. I'd now like to ask Sal Fazal, our committee officer, if we have any apologies for today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received.
Lovely. The second item on the agenda is declaration of interests. They're on pages 1 to 4 of your agenda pack. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out in item 2, and can I ask if members have any other interests to declare? Gareth Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Not so much a declaration of interest, but just for transparency, Mr Ruddick is here as member of the London Tree Officers Association, but he's also one of my officers at Richmond upon Thames Council.
For which we'll just refer back to the notes on pages 1 to 4, because you are also a councillor, indeed the leader of Richmond Council. So that's for transparency. There is no pecuniary aspect to that at all. Otherwise, is that noted? Does anyone else want to add anything to the declarations? No? OK, noted. Thank you. Because this is the first meeting in the new year, we have to agree the membership of the committee, the terms of reference for the committee and standing delegations of authority to us. Can I propose that, and if this is acceptable, can we take items 3, 4 and 5 together? Is that OK? OK, in which case, can I ask that the committee note the membership and the chairing arrangements, the terms of reference and the standing delegations and authority for the Environment Committee as agreed by the Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The minutes are on pages 5 to 60 of the meeting held on the 4th of March. Could I ask the committee to confirm that the minutes are a correct record? Agreed. Thank you. And we also have the summary list of actions on pages 61 to 78. That includes the completed, closed and ongoing actions from our previous meetings. Could I ask the committee to note all of these? Thank you. And also, could you note action taken under delegated authority by the former chair, Assemblymember Polansky, which, following consultation with party group lead members, to agree our report, London, a growing city. Is that noted? Thank you. Trees in a changing climate. We got there. Right. I'm really pleased to move on to today's main item of business, a discussion of London's trees, obviously in an urban changing climate. And I would like to welcome our guests. First of all, we have Kevin Martin, who is Head of Tree Collections and Arboriculture at Kew. You're very welcome. We have Craig Ruddick, just referred to by Assemblymember Roberts, who is a committee member from the London Tree Officers Association and the Arboriculture Manager from the London Borough of Richmond on Thames. Or is that the Royal Borough? You're not royal.
No, we are the People's Borough of Richmond upon Thames.
Just checking, because I know you've got some. I know you have one or two. You've mentioned the Royal Parks occasionally, Gareth. I thought perhaps you might have been made a Royal Borough. No. Kate Sheldon, hello, who's the Chief Executive of Trees for Cities. You're very welcome. We also have Keith. I'm probably not going to pronounce this properly. Saker. Keith Saker, who is the Director of Urban Forestry from Barcham Trees, which is a tree nursery. And finally, we have Abby Chrysostomou, who we have had many times in front of us. He's the Head of Green Infrastructure here at the Greater London Authority. You're very welcome as well. So I'm delighted to see you all. And we're going to start, as is traditional, with a couple of questions from me, and then we'll go around the rest of the panel. So the first question is to all of you. I will probably start with Abby and then just move down the row. But what impacts are we already seeing on London's trees from a changing climate due to changing temperatures and indeed changing rainfall patterns? We've just heard this morning that this has been the driest spring ever on record. Abby.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and welcome to the new chair. Thanks to the old chair. I just wanted to say thank you for bringing this as a topic. I think it's a really important one. We talk a lot in the kind of green infrastructure world, and especially on trees, about the role of trees and GI for helping address the impacts of climate change. But actually, they are also things that are impacted by climate change, and when they're impacted, they don't work as well in terms of all the benefits, whether that's the climate change benefits or the kind of the health and other wider benefits. So really appreciate you bringing this today. My fellow members of the table here are much more expert in the kind of impacts on trees than I am, so I will probably leave it to them to give a lot of the detail. But I think we're seeing a lot of those impacts across London, and as I said, the degree to which the impacts of climate change are reducing kind of the ability for cooling from trees. They're making the life of trees shorter. They're making them harder to manage. All those sorts of things are affecting us. And as through the London Urban Forest Partnership, we did some research with some of the people here today were involved with the London Urban Forest Resilience Report, and the information that came out of that was really quite serious, really like the impacts that we might find here in London, which is why we've put resilience as one of the new key principles for success in the updated action plan for the London Urban Forest Plan, and we've put quite a number of actions in that for the GLA to lead on in this space. So 6 out of the 11 actions on resilience the GLA is involved with, and that includes commissioning this new work that Kevin will talk a lot more about, but I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you, Abby. Keith, do you want to add to that?
I'll try. What are the impacts of climate change visible now? Well, it's very easy to get confused with normal urban pressures and impacts of climate change. So if I can just summarise, I think trees are under greater stress earlier. It's becoming more difficult to establish young trees beyond the first 3-4 years, when the maintenance period tends to disappear, and we're then working with the tree being in its own environment and basically looking after itself. You have the problem with the potential for increased pest and disease. I know that's sort of something that's very topical and very, I'm sure it's at the foremost of your mind. And then we've got the problematic thing with species that have been here for some time that previously didn't seed are now beginning to seed. So, and there's several examples at the moment. So you've got that. So in summary, that's a very loose summary, but it's very easy to get carried away and blame everything on climate change when there is a lot of, and we'll come on to this later, I've no doubt, a lot of the practices in the way we actually plant and manage trees that also cause stress and strain to trees within the population.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that if there are points that you want to bring out about the way that we manage trees in the urban environment, we're the London Assembly, but obviously, you know, what we're looking at is true probably for lots of other cities, and 80% of the population now lives in cities, so the things that we look at here quite often have resonance elsewhere as well. But yes, it's the urban environment as well as the changing climate. Kate, do you want to carry on with some further points on this area?
Yeah, and building on some of what Keith said. So at Trees for Cities, we the majority of our work is around planting, so it's that vulnerable early stage of trees' lives. So obviously the unpredictability of and changing patterns is where we're seeing a lot of issues. Our response to that as practitioners is starting to look at different species, so working with Kew and others on looking at species that are more resilient to climate change or periods of drought, really, is what it boils down to. That's what we're looking at. And we're starting to see certain species struggling more than others. So rowan, for example, we're seeing is struggling a lot. We are also looking at adapting our planting specifications. So we're particularly mulching is really important. So when we plant whips and when creating woodland habitat, then we are really putting much more mulch down and remulching through the maintenance period, through the summer period. So just to help the trees to to survive those longer periods of drought. So sort of various technical kind of adaptations to our specifications is what we're seeing. And it's kind of, it can be simpler in some ways to increase the amount of watering that you're doing for standard trees when you've got, you know, you're going tree by tree, but for whip planting then it's difficult. So that's where the mulch is the more kind of preventative measure that we're taking.
So the impacts, Craig, that we're hearing are around lack of water. I think if I can just sum that up. What other impacts are we seeing in the urban environment due to this changing climate that we're living in?
So I would echo comments of the previous contributors. With regards to what Keith has said, there's various factors that are in play, but I can speak about what we're observing and what I'm seeing. I think there's certainly canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, with species such as horse chestnut. That's an interesting species because there are a number of factors affecting it at the moment, such as pest and disease, and drought intolerance as well. And I've seen in cases where these trees are being reduced, that seems to be another factor that ends up pushing them over the edge and declining. Also, we're seeing patterns of growth affected with that particular species. So you'll see it coming into flower when it should be going into a phase where it's losing its leaves. So pre-autumn, it's coming into flower, which is a disrupted system. We're seeing decline of birch, decline of rowan, and we're seeing prevalence of sooty bark disease affecting sycamore, which is of a concern because that follows a period of dry weather. If we have consecutive dry summers, I'm concerned about what the overall impact on sycamore, which is a significant contributor to London's canopy, is going to be. I think that around water stress and around aftercare, there's perhaps entrenched practice around how we've always done that. And I think the challenge is how we modify that and move forward with aftercare programmes. The amount of watering that's going to be required, that's very difficult to achieve, I think, by typical contracts that operate within local authorities. Best practice is really around watering little and often. So if you every couple of days during drought stress, you're better off with a combination, I think, of local authority plus the community being involved in that. There's a sense of, if we can be allies in delivering that now, I think that's a better way perhaps. But certainly there's increased demand on watering, which is very difficult to meet from a management perspective and also budgetary demands as well. I think the unpredictability of weather patterns year on year, that's very difficult to plan for. At the moment, for example, we're going through a very stressful period of no rain. We usually see calls to arms for residents to help with watering going out in the summer, whereas we're considering that sort of action in April and May now. So there's an education thing there as well, I think, in getting everybody on board. I think it's fair to say that if the unpredictability it really stifles our ability to be proactive as well. So it's there's some messaging to be done around that, I think.
Yes, I mean, certainly I see messaging from not the tree officers, but the tree wardens in the boroughs that I represent, and some of them have been expressing, large amounts of concern, not just this year, but in previous years. Kevin, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to go straight on afterwards into another question about what's going to happen over the next 50 years, and how do we think that the additional challenges of the next 50 years are going to impact. But if you want to add anything to what's just been said and then move on into what we think we might be facing.
It is, it's an interesting time. So from what all the panel have discussed, those species that everyone's brought to the forefront of being, seeing in decline now, that we know that would happen. So from a lot of the research we've done, a lot of the species that we're currently planting in our urban environments are just not suited to be planted in urban environments. That, we have to really think really carefully now on getting the species selection right. Trees that we know have the plasticity to deal with drought stress like we're seeing now. Also, combined with that is how we plant trees. I've just come back from Malmö in Sweden, and they are very far advanced of what we're doing now in London. They're even going to the stage where they're creating their own soils. So when they do get rain, they can hold the moisture for a lot longer. So they're using a mix of perlite and biochar and also soft organic mulch, and they're really buying into it, and they're increasing their planting pits. So there's lots of things we have to look at to get the establishment of trees in London. Now, we have to remember London is a big urban heat island. We can't get away from that. A lot of the stress that we're seeing now is a combination of, one, the climate is shifting, but secondly, it's because of the urban heat island. We have a lot of soil capping, we have a lot of concrete, and we have a lot of glass. And now all that combines will increase the pressures, okay? To give you an idea today, that London is approximately 3 degrees warmer than your average rural temperatures. Now, when we see these increasing temperatures, we know that we have a vast increase in water demand by the plants. Okay, we know most trees that we plant can deal with heat stress. What they cannot deal with is the water stress. Okay, and now with the soil capping and the limited soil volume that tree has in order to have water within the soil, and water availability is really what's starting to affect the trees. Now, we do a lot of work in the steppe environment. Now, we look at the steppe because those trees have genetically adapted to deal with weather patterns that we're seeing today. So they are on free draining sand or silt that was blown in the last ice age, which creates the steppe environment. Those trees have adapted to deal with that free draining nature and the inconsistency of rainfall. Okay, I've just come back from there, and it is super dry already, and the soil cracking. But those trees. You want to
just tell us which steps?
So this was in Romania.
Romania.
So I've just come back from Romania in the steppe in the southern Romania. Now, the reason why we went there in spring is to look at how the species composition works when it goes into this drought in spring. Now, what we're doing is trying to select seed from trees from there, because we know they will have more plasticity to deal with these stresses. And that's something we have to understand. We really have to think a lot more deeply on what we're planting, where and why. And instead of planting trees just for the sake of planting trees, we have to think about those functions. And it's the functions in the urban environment. Now, if we go from the modelling work that we've done under an SSP3 model, so your worst case scenario modelling for London, today, on average, we're about 10 degrees mean annual temperature. By 2100, we're going to be at 14.9. Okay, so it's a 4-degree shift. And that's because of urban heat islands as well. And there's more and more pressure being built on London to create urban dwellings. This will increase that pressure. We then have to look at rainfall. Rainfall's our most important thing when we think of trees because of water demand. Now, our predicted precipitation levels by 2100 is only 660 mil. Currently, we're at 620. So what that means is as a researcher, I will look at the predictions of heat and look at how much water those plants are going to need realistically to survive in that environment. Now, if we're to look at that, we're going to need nearly 1,000 mil of precipitation for trees to deal with that heat if we carry on planting the same species that we're currently planting.
So in terms of the requirements of the trees, I mean, obviously that's talking about going into the future and the urban environment and the rain change, the levels of rainfall dropping dramatically.
Yep.
And therefore, but at the same time, heat going up, so the tree needs more water just when the amount of rainfall is going down. How does it differ, though, for trees that we might be planting on the street and that particular environment, as opposed to those that we might be planting in parks or woodlands?
Yeah, so this is going to be a really interesting thing to understand because it goes down to soil volume. So if you look at parks, depending on how you plant your species composition, you can create cooler areas, okay? And therefore you can have a different species composition. So you could have more natives, as it were, in parks because you've got more soil volume. You've got more soil volume, you've got more water availability. Also, we have to understand how trees deal with different stresses. Some trees are what we call stress avoiders, so they rely on having really big root systems and really deep roots. and that's how they deal with the drought. So things like oak, for instance, is one of the best ones to use. But when we're looking at, especially within our urban environment, and we're looking in our paved areas, we need to be thinking about the stress-tolerating trees. So they're trees that have functional traits in order to carry on growing in times of drought. So things like Tilia tomentosa, for instance, the silver lime, which is readily available, that will flick its leaves upside down and show its underbelly where it's got light hair, and it reflects the heat, but that hair collects moisture, which then cools the leaf down and allows the tree to carry on functioning, therefore providing an ecosystem service. Now, these are the things that we have to think about now, and that's when I talk about thinking about the function. That's thinking about the function of that tree and how it adapts to grow within the urban environment, and not just planting it because it's got a pretty bark or pretty flower. We have to really think hard when we select these species and what we want that function in that landscape to do, and that's what we have to get on top of.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to pass you over to Assembly Member Gareth Roberts now, and I'm also going to apologise to him because I think I just stole one of his questions.
Well, quite. I mean, my question was going to be, how will the impacts of climate change on trees in London differ between those in parks or woodlands and those of street trees? Which I think you just really fairly well covered that off.
Yeah, so it's going to be, it's really interesting. So, especially for Richmond Park, it's both local to both of us, we know it very well. Now, we have to be realistic that we will have to start thinking about where we source the next generation of oak tree. Okay, the English oak, well, common oak of Europe. Okay, for instance, common oak, Quercus robur, has a really large distribution range. Now, we know from the modelling work that we've done, we have to start selecting English oak from its driest and hottest observation, because there it has adapted to deal with our future climate. What we're seeing now, I'm seeing it in the gardens at Kew, we're seeing a lot of Quercus robur going into decline. Now, that is a combination of pest and disease, things like acute oak decline, but also the drying out. Currently, I've got lots of dendrometers on oaks in Kew, because I want to understand what's really happening with the English oak, because it's really water sensitive. I've done lots of tests in the labs, I won't bore you with how we do that, but we do know that English oak is the most water sensitive, so it's really drought sensitive. So we really have to think about where the next generation comes from. We still need to plant English oak because of the biodiversity values, but we're going to have to think long and hard of where we source the material, and it's not always going to be appropriate to use local provenance seed, and that is something that we have to get an understanding to the public. We can still plant these native trees and native tree species compositions, but we're going to have to source the seed from better suited environments.
Thank you. Craig, you're probably on the sharper end of the street trees issue, so how are you finding that climate change is affecting street trees particularly?
I think, as I mentioned before, we've got a classic palette of trees that, and many of those species are going to be vulnerable to the effects of a changing climate. So we are seeing that, and we are concerned that that's going to continue. And I think what's really important is understanding, whether that's a single borough or across London, is understanding what the overall risk is, and risk mapping that targets understanding what the makeup of species is within any particular borough and what those vulnerabilities are. Much like what Kew have been speaking about recently, where you can place a percentage on the number of trees that are unlikely to be suitable in a climate of 2100. I think if boroughs had that information, that would be a really important early warning system to refer to. I think it's also important that I say that the London Urban Forest Partnership have been working towards these actions and aims and establishing how we can gather this data. So I think that it's important that that's supported and that continues. I think that there is a difference between how we're managing our trees in footways, in streets and in our parks. Parks often seen as a more natural environment, but in my experience, trees in parks can sometimes be more difficult to establish than trees in the highway. And it's difficult to really understand why. I think in some cases they're more exposed. In some cases they are not as accessible for watering and aftercare. So there's a number of factors there I think that needs to be understood. But something that I note within our park sites is we've got many trees that we would consider to be veterans, heritage trees, really important specimens. And I think there's a point of interest in how we're managing the soil environment within those sites. If you go to somewhere like Kew, there's careful management of the soil environment within park sites, but within our own parks and open spaces, there's again, I mentioned this earlier, established practice around how we manage those sites based upon what's gone before. And I think we need to be establishing management practice based upon what we anticipate in the future. And that requires research, but it also requires imagination. And I think that imagination needs to sit with the tree managers, but also bringing the population, the people, the community on board with that.
Okay, thank you. If any of the other panel members have thoughts on this particular issue, the management of trees, either in parks or street trees, and the impact of climate change, notwithstanding your earlier comments, Keith.
Where do I start? I think there's many aspects of this, and just talking about climate change can induce silo thinking. So I think we've got to appreciate that while heat is one of the likely outcomes of climate change, it's not the only one. You know, we're already seeing large numbers of abnormal weather events. We're seeing flooding. We're seeing, so it's not only the tree's ability to sustain resistance to heat. I subscribe to everything that Kevin has said. I think it's very easy though to look for simple recipes. So the soil volume argument, I think we have to be realistic that in many of our urban areas we're not going to be able to provide the soil volume that's recommended because we're retrofitting trees into existing street situations where complete upheaval of the infrastructure is not going to be practical. So what would I say? I think I'm well aware of the work that Kevin and others are doing in the Caucasus, Tingling Mountains and other places, looking for species, looking for genotypes that have the inbuilt characteristics to sustain and survive in the stresses that are likely to be apparent with climate change. But we have an existing tree population, and again, I think we have to look at the way we manage and the investment in the tree population we already have. And as I said, we talk about planting offers as a substitute, but one of those plane trees on the embankment, if we lose one of those, the volumetric replacement numbers is something like 40-1. So every one of those that you lose, you've got replacement, just in terms of canopy, volume of canopy, not height of canopy. You're going to be in a position where that's the sort of ratio. So the management and increasing the longevity of the trees that we've already got, taking those into the future, because it's an illusion to think we're going to increase canopy cover by volumetric planting in the foreseeable future. It's a 20-30 year curve. So what we've got now is going to provide the immediate company. Moving on from there, I think there is a complete, we plan according to political time or human time. We don't plan according to tree time. We have to look at populations as something, it's not population management over a 70-year time span, it's population management over 100, 150-year time span. I know very few where there are long-term scheduled plans in place with outcomes expressed. So we get the, again, often spurious political, we're going to increase canopy cover by 10, 15%. No insult, no. What's your canopy cover now? We don't know. And we're going to do this in a 10-year period. No, we're not. Not in 10 years. It's impossible. So realistic target setting. Let's make long-term targets based on outcomes. What do we want our urban forests to look like 50, 100, 150 years' time? How do we plan for that? That will include different and the use of different species, and Kevin's quite right. We need to think about provenance. We need to think about where our starter stock comes from in terms of its natural adaptations. But there's not a nursery in the UK could tell you the provenance of its species that are being sold into the UK at the moment. For instance, Liriodendron tulip tree. Its natural range is from North America up from New England right the way down at the tips of Florida. When you've been lucky enough, as I have, to actually visit and look, you could be looking at different trees when you're going to both ends of the range. We sell Liriodendron at Bartram, and pretty much every other nursery in the UK sells Liriodendron. There's not one of us actually knows where it come from. There was a study done in Sweden probably 10 years ago, a European-wide study, and only one nursery in Europe was able to give any indication of where the trees come from. And I'm aware I'm rambling on here. So, and then the other thing you've got to look at is the romantic political association with trees. It always seems to me it's very palatable to talking about numbers of trees planted. We don't talk about the number of trees that are actually going to be there in 25 years' time. We don't talk about outcomes. So we're playing at the moment, we're playing very much a numbers game based on volume. Let's put as many in the ground without considering what are those trees going to do, why are we planting that species there, for what purpose, and move away from numbers with outcomes. So we want to know what we're going to plant, where we're going to plant it, what it's going to deliver. That means there has to be a movement or an increased investment in managing maintenance. Because I've been working with the London Tree Officers Association for the best part of 30 years. And one of the biggest gaps is the money they have available to maintain the trees that they're responsible for. I don't know Craig's numbers, but I would estimate that Craig is going to be responsible for anything between 30 and 45,000 trees. I wager his budget. Something the Asset Register Company, Asset Register Group, suggested that the maintenance of an asset should have something like 0.5 or 1% of that asset's capital value reinvested every year. I'm sure Craig and others would be jumping up and down. We can put an asset value on the trees. The investment levels don't go anywhere near that 0.5%. So there you go. That's me done for a little while.
Excellent, thank you. I feel terribly seen, Chair. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our next group of questions. We're going to hear from Assembly Member Keith Prince, who's going to continue on this area.
Thank you, Chair. My question initially is for Craig, and then I'll move on to Abby, if that's okay, but others feel free to join in. So my question, Craig, is how feasible would it be to collate a London-wide database of trees removed and their cause of death?
So most, if not all, London boroughs will be operating an asset management system. Within that system, we've got regimes of surveys, and as a result of those surveys, we're identifying where tree works needs to be carried out, including removal. Now, assuming that those asset management systems are all up to date, then you should be able to extrapolate from that on a London-wide basis the species that are being removed. So, on the face of it, I think it's fair to say that the data exists. I would go back to something that Keith just said, and I think that what's obvious to me is there needs to be baselines established as to what we're assuming is out there already, what we're expecting to see, what data do we need in order to move forward. But in answer to the specific question, I would assume that data to exist, so there is an opportunity to collate and gather it.
Abby, how do you sit with that one?
So this is one of the actions in the London Urban Forest Plan, and so we are sort of thinking about and starting discussions with the L2A, which Craig represents, about how we might collate that information. Does everybody have it? I mean, everybody should have the information, but the degree to which they can keep it updated, the degree to which they have the capacity to share that information, it's all really different across different boroughs. I think today we have just published an updated public realm tree map, previously called the London Street Tree Map. And that's not all the trees in London, but that's trees in the public realm from most of the boroughs and a few other kind of public entities like royal parks. But even that kind of more basic data collection, which is just what trees are there, is difficult, and not every borough can respond to that. So I think we're really interested in working with boroughs to find out how we can collate that information. But I think then the really key question is, what do we do with that information once we have it? And I know that there are concerns that there are legitimate reasons sometimes for tree felling or tree loss, and so trying to help people understand the data and understand where there are legitimate reasons and proper end of life or proper safety concerns versus where there was losses that might not have had to happen, and where that we might be able to identify recommendations to support others on best practice.
And do you keep a record of the trees that the mayor contributes towards planting, for instance?
So we don't have a record. The mayor's funded the planting of more than 600,000 trees. We don't have a record of all of those trees, so we know kind of where they are. We have some maps, but we don't have kind of a long-term tracking mechanism. So most of those trees. I actually don't have the stats on me, but quite a lot of those trees will be planted by boroughs or from organisations like Trees for Cities that do track their trees, so we have the ability to track them through those organisations, but we don't keep a database.
I'm sure you're aware that before his election to mayor back in 2016, the mayor promised Londoners that he would plant 2 million trees. So you've just said that 9 years later, he's only achieved around about less than a third of that target. Do you know when he plans to plant the other 1.4 million trees that he promised Londoners in his election promises?
The formal commitment for tree planting that was in the London Environment Strategy is a 10% increase in tree canopy cover, which we are still working towards. And I think, kind of building on what Keith has said, it is difficult sometimes to think about tree planting only from a numbers perspective. One, because tree planting itself is not the only thing we need to do to maintain the urban forest. Actually, the maintenance of existing trees is more important in terms of maintaining that canopy and those benefits, because those bigger trees are more important for that. But also, it's really important, the kind of principle of right tree, right place. And when you're working in an urban forest, an urban environment, some of the most important areas for tree planting are difficult places like streets and street trees, and that's much more expensive and much more difficult and time-consuming to plant. And so if you're thinking about only a numbers game, it can sometimes lead to perverse incentives of trying to just sort of put, small whips in lots of places that might, places that might need it, but might not need it as much as other areas where there's a low tree canopy cover and maybe kind of issues of deprivation. So trying to focus on getting that kind of right mix of tree planting, right tree, right place, but also that mix of new trees and supporting the protection and maintenance of existing trees, I think is the philosophy behind supporting this tree canopy cover target.
So my namesake Keith said about realistic targets. Clearly, what you were saying was a criticism of the mayor's unrealistic promise of 2 million trees. Will you be speaking with the mayor to ask him to make more realistic promises in future to the people of London?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chair. I don't think this is an appropriate question for an officer. And secondly, Keith, you know very well that the manifesto was not 2 million trees at all.
As I said to the mayor in 2016, although the 2 million tree promise wasn't in his manifesto, it was a promise that he made in the run-up to the election. That's on record. And also, when I questioned him about that, as to whether or not people should believe what he says in the run-up to elections, his answer was, well, it depends. And I think that says everything.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to pose those questions to the panel, was the point that Assemblymember McCartney was making, if you don't mind. So I'm going to move on now to Assemblymember Polanski, who is the next person who is going to pick up the questioning on issues relating to trees.
Thank you very much. Abby, you were just talking about the Pan-London approach and that lots of different things are happening at the borough level. The London Urban Forest Plan 2025 update says that there is future plans for coordination to monitor the impacts of climate change on trees and woodland, but it's subject to funding. Just to ask if there's more update on this.
Yeah, so in the kind of first phase of delivery of the London Urban Forest Plan, we were able to work with several partners to apply for funding to DEFRA through the Trees Cost Action Fund. So we got £500,000 for 3 years, which funded a coordinator post, which sat with the GLA, and I think it was about 8 organisations to deliver several of the actions within the LUFP. So that funding ended in March this year, and so we're still working with the partnership to decide how to go forward with a different mechanism. That Trees Called Action Fund is not available now. We think that some of the delivery of the actions could be funded through the forthcoming Green Roots programme that's coming up soon, but that won't fund everything, and so it's likely that there might be a need to apply for external funding again, so those discussions are still very live.
Thank you. And then just briefly, you were talking about the 600,000 trees that have been planted across London, and I totally accept the point that some of them are trees for cities, some of them are boroughs, so it's difficult to track. But then it does seem like an obvious answer to go, let's have a database, partly, to be honest, so the mayor can show off is the wrong phrase, but go look at all these trees I planted, and then everyone in London can see where those are being planted. Also, if there's a disproportionate amount in one borough but not in another borough, then it's easy to go, well, okay, let's sort this out because this isn't working right. Why is that not tracked?
So some of it is tracked. I mean, part of it is just literally a data availability and how and the kind of expectations we put on the folks and the organisations that we fund. So in early stages of our funding, we might not have required them to provide the GIS kind of data, so for us to collect that. So for most of I think all of our trees, we know kind of what borough, we know the area, and so we have kind of a non-mapped version of understanding where things are. We have kind of informally mapped where a lot of that tree planting has happened, and there are some discussions happening internally about how we can improve that, so we might be able to share it and use it in different ways. But there's always kind of this balance of what are we asking of our grantees and the information that they provide to us, and then also what we, us wanting to have information to use it for whatever purpose. I think one of our tree planting programs, which was through the Forestry Commission's Urban Tree Challenge Fund, also had quite kind of significant requirements on mapping of the trees, and we've managed to get the data for those, but have seen that's been quite difficult for the grantees to provide that information in a timely way and in kind of an easy to access way. So it's just trying to manage how to manage that data. So not something we're not trying to do. I think we're just trying to figure out the best way to do it.
Genuinely not sniping from the sidelines. I'm really pleased about all this good work you're doing. And it's definitely not an accusation against anyone on this panel. My boyfriend regularly plants with Trees for Cities, for instance, and comes home incredibly happy every time he does. But if you're giving a grant, it seems like a really reasonable request to say, please go plant the trees, but also let us know what trees you're planting and where. Otherwise, it seems very odd to just kind of go, off you go.
So, I mean, that's true, especially for organisations that have the ability to do that, like the Trees for Cities and TCVs of the world, but not, so for example, we funded a couple organisations, TCV was one of them, to do sort of free tree packs to give out to folks. And, they're asked to kind of register their postcode when they took them, but there's no kind of ability to track, like, where exactly did they plant them once they took them away from the giveaway site, and where did they put it? So there's elements of some of the programs that we have where it's difficult to track, but there's also, like, large parts of our programs where we can track, and we do track. So, and I don't have a good idea of the percentage just off the top of my head, but yeah.
Last question, just I'm genuinely trying to understand. From what Craig and Kevin were saying, in fact, the whole panel, where we plant trees and what trees we're planting is really important, and also you have to understand the relationship between the trees is it not a problem then if we're saying to people, here's a free tree pack, off you go, and we're going to fund you to do it or provide some support to do it, but we're not expecting any feedback back, so we can be making sure that we're monitoring correctly that the environment is suitable for those trees?
So as I said, there's lots of different components to our tree programs, and that's just one small part of it. And a large part of the benefit of that element is the kind of engagement and bringing people in. And we do have, there is an element of aftercare where people are on an email list so they can get advice and they can get information and they can share the information about location for that. But the majority of our programs fund kind of big organizations and land managers and things like that, like boroughs, to plant trees in that kind of targeted way, where they've considered the proper design and considered kind of all those elements of right tree, right place.
Thank you. I guess looking at anyone else on the panel, I'm not ganging up on Abby here, you're doing good work, but would anyone like to contribute in terms of if this would be helpful? Kate?
Yeah, so we don't do the free tree packs. I'm personally not a fan, to be honest, because I think you do then lose control of where the trees are planted and what the trees are and where they're going, and you lose that whole right tree, right place. So without wanting to kind of be overly critical of those schemes, it's not a route we've gone down. I think one of the benefits of those schemes is giving the community a role, giving them something to do, and we'll come on to some of that later. But there's so much that people can do and want to do, and those links aren't being made. You've got trees that need looking after, you've got people who want to do stuff to help, you've got expertise, and it's bringing those things together and making sure that the actions that people take are meaningful and useful and regular. And going back to the question around tracking trees lost and keeping those records updated, which is difficult for local authorities to do, but you've got people there, and people, as we know from the recent felling in Enfield, I live in Enfield, people never get more vociferous about trees than when they see them go. So there's a real opportunity there, for people to be saying that this tree's been lost on our street, reporting that in. You could have an app, or there are ways to do it, and then people can feel involved and feel like they're making a difference. So I suppose that's the message: is that there's the free trees piece, but we do quite regularly see those free trees not doing that well, and I think if you're going to do that, and TCV and others who do those schemes, they do offer guidance on planting the trees as well. I'm genuinely not criticising that, but I just think there are other actions that communities can take that actually could help to add value to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about already.
That's really helpful, thank you. I'm dying to ask you about Enfield, but I will pass over to my colleague in a moment.
Just to give you a quick outline of where we're going to go to with all the rest of the questions, because obviously we are talking and we want to think about the protections for existing trees and how we should be looking after them. So we're going to talk a bit about protections for existing trees. Then we want to also talk about choice of trees, because, I don't think anyone is suggesting notwithstanding, who's promised what in terms of numbers, but planting new trees is something we are going to continue to do. So we want to talk about the choice of trees, because obviously selecting trees that are going to have the best, chance in 100, 200, 500 years' time. Then we want to talk about the availability of trees and how long does it, because it's not as though you can say, oh yes, I'd like a tree next week and here's an acorn and it's going to grow into my lovely oak trees on Tooting Common in 5 minutes. That's not a thing. So we want to talk about that. And then finally, we want to talk about tree care. So obviously that applies both to newly planted with particular requirements, but also longer standing trees as well. So now, having said all of that, just to give you an idea of where you might want to contribute, I am going to come to Assemblymember McCartney, who is going to talk about the protection of existing trees and whether it's adequate.
Yes, hello. I represent Enfield, and the White Webb's ancient oak tree has made the news recently, and what surprised me about that was actually the lack of protection. And I think even though it was on the Woodland Trust's ancient tree inventory, I was quite surprised to see that most ancient trees actually don't have tree protection orders on them. And so I just wanted to gauge the panel's views on what further protections are needed, For example, if trees are of a certain age, should they automatically have a protection order on them? Or could we learn from other cities or countries where there's best practice? For example, I know in Toronto, they have a permit system where most trees, if you're going to fell them or do anything, you need a city permit to carry that out. I don't know who wants to go first. I can see Kevin nodding at the end, so I'm going to pick on you, I'm afraid.
So we do have a protection system in place. We have conservation areas and we have tree protection orders. I think what it comes down to, if we're to be realistic, Craig will tell you more than what I will, but it's resources to enable local authorities to make sure they've got the trees of significance under rather a conservation area or tree protection order. It takes boots on the ground, and it takes, you've got to get that planning process in place. And I think we're going through a really big shift culturally as well in the UK. You've got to remember, previously, trees were never... I was a commercial tree surgeon for many years. Trees were always seen as a nuisance. It's only in the last decade that we are starting to see this real big cultural shift where there is a want by the general public to start protecting some of these trees. And it's an amazing thing for me as a tree person to start seeing that shift, and things like the Sycamore Gap have definitely brought that to the forefront. But I do think we need to keep pushing on with that and don't let it go out of the public eye, because as soon as that news story stops, it'll all go forgotten about again. So it is something that we need to do, but it's more of a cultural thing that we need to address in the UK, and the importance of trees and biodiversity. I honestly think that's where we need to go.
Thank you. And Craig, I'm going to come to you because you are the officer that is contacted if something untoward happens to a tree in your local area. Is there any view for the London tree officers as to what extra protections you might like to see?
I think it's important to understand that we act inside of an existing legal framework, and the Town and Country Planning Act and the wording around tree protection there is what guides us towards at the point at where a tree is protected. Now, the principal components of that are public visual amenity. So is that tree visible to the public? And is there a threat, a known threat of removal? They're the key drivers towards a decision whether or not to protect the tree. And that does not take into account the ecosystem services, biodiversity, a plethora of benefits that are provided by trees. So I think it's a fundamental question of whether or not the law supports us in what it is we're doing in the first instance. As tree officers across London delivering tree protection, I think a key area of support is around enforcement and ensuring that where things do happen and protection is in place, that's followed up on, and through to prosecutions and relevant cases. So that tackles the existing protection mechanisms that we're involved in. There are also sort of planning conditions in place to protect trees within sites of proposed development, for example. But in terms of ancient trees or heritage trees, I think that there needs to be consideration as to what's appropriate in terms of how we can start to protect them. And I'm not sure that the existing framework really allows for that to happen. If there was a known threat to the tree, then obviously the local authority can act. But if you don't know about it, then it's very difficult to do something, even when the work is underway. The emergency process of serving a preservation order is a lengthy one. You have to go through a number of hoops to get the documentation served.
Yeah, and does the London Tree Office Association have any ideas as to how they would like to see perhaps the legislation or protections enhanced? Or do you?
I'll go back to what I said earlier about how we value trees. I think it's an education thing. It's quite antiquated, the way that we're approaching tree protection around the beauty and human perception. I think our understanding in London, residents, tree officers, etc., around the value of trees is gone way beyond just, well, it's nice to look at, or actually if it were lost in the landscape, you'd notice it. And there's a lot more depth to it, and that needs to be captured, I think, in the discussion around how the law might change and how we can reasonably apply it. Because it's all about what's reasonable at the moment. It's reasonable for us to act in response to a known threat at the moment, but that's because the law supports that form of action. But yeah, it's about how we value trees and how that's then is reflected in the law.
And I mentioned Toronto, which has a permit system. Obviously, local authorities would need resources to deal with that, but would that be one suggestion that your officers might find favour with?
I think that's the key thing. Is it's resourcing. It's how you would administer such a procedure. I'm not entirely sure how you could go from a situation that we have now to a situation like that. It would need to be very carefully thought through. I mean, one thing I would say is I think there's a lot of value in community support, and there's been obviously there's a lot of interest in retrospect of these actions, and it's about harnessing that support before.
A petition of 50,000 people was signed because of the Enfield
Indeed,
tree, yeah.
But I think that it's about the key thing is understanding where these trees are in the first place and garnering that support proactively as opposed to it being a reactive situation.
Okay, so if we were to recommend, for example, that the government reviewed existing legislation, would that be something that you'd be favour of? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
So I've seen indications from 2 Assembly members that they would like to come in on this area, and the first one is Assembly Member Gareth Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably a question for Abby. It's following on from this idea of trees being removed. We've been contacted by residents and local councillors about the West Cromwell Road and Tesco supermarket, which had a planning application. I'm not expecting you to comment on the individual thing. It's more about the generality of the point. But it was a planning application which the mayor approved, where trees were on the land that would not be further developed, were healthy, and in an area of London of with high levels of air pollution, and yet the trees were removed. And the question is sort of how much does the planning team within the Mayor's office come to your office to say, look, we've got these trees on site. What are your views? Can you give us any insight? Because it does feel rather perverse that healthy trees are being removed when there's no need to it from an application which has been approved by the Mayor.
So I can't comment on the individual case, but in terms of kind of how that works, so applications that are referred to the mayor, they are reviewed by the planning team. But where they need some extra expertise in my area, we have support from my team to that. So we do comment in the assessment of applications, but the actual kind of, once the planning approval has gone through and the kind of follow on site and the development, we're not involved at all on kind of enforcement or, review after planning applications have been approved, my team that is. But, one thing I was going to note to Craig's point earlier is that the London Plan, the current London Plan, does have an existing policy that is actually stronger than national requirements in terms of, so it's policy G7 in terms of protection of veteran trees and also trying to recognise the value of those trees, referencing the British standard and the use of evaluation system like iTree or CAVET to go into the decision-making behind whether trees should be protected or not. But of course, all that, your question and kind of Craig's comments before, all of that is for trees that come through the development and the planning process, and so it doesn't address things that are outside of that process. So that's just sort of a follow-up to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to come over to Assembly Member Polanski now again.
Thanks, Chair. Craig, if I can pick up on what you're talking about in terms of how do we value trees. My understanding from Enfield is that the Toby Carvery, the argument was that this was dangerous to cars and this was a car park. They went and got a report from officers that weren't council officers that said, this needs to go because it's dangerous to cars. Taking Kevin's point about how people are valuing trees more and seeing trees more, what needs to happen in the national conversation that we value nature and we value trees more than we value a car parking space?
That's a really good question. I'd broaden this out to how we manage trees, where we're looking for planting locations. We're up against so many challenges. A lot of them, frankly, are brought about through the demand for the use of cars, and whether that's street parking, pavement parking, access to driveways. The driveways themselves are then a paved environment, so that contributes towards flood risk, etc., etc. I think there's a narrative that needs to be formed to shift the understanding of what trees are within our communities and the services they're providing. And I mentioned earlier about a need for imagination, and I think that something that myself and other tree officers have to do, we're managing an existing tree resource based upon, in part, the expectations of our current population and their understanding of and their demands. But we're also having to imagine what the population's demands might be in 30, 40, 50 years' time, and thinking, okay, well, the way we're managing our trees now conflicts with perhaps the demands of the future. So I think that there's work to be done around the understanding of the value and bring about that sort of collective imagination of the importance of trees. I also think that if we can see community tree planting and trees within communities as allies in a fight against climate change, or against but in adapting to a changing climate, that would go some way towards perhaps shifting that mindset as to how we manage and care for our trees.
That's a really strong answer, thank you. Abby, I realise this is cross-cutting and not necessarily all your area, but we know we need to have traffic reduction, we know we need to have less parking because we need more people going on public transport. Is an argument that could be made here, or needs to be made here, around more protection for trees and less protection for car parking spaces?
Probably not the right person to answer that question. I mean, I think, one of the things, I'll pivot that to a different answer, is one of the things we're working on within the green infrastructure team is kind of mapping all the different needs. And so this is wider than trees, but it's mapping all the different needs that different green infrastructure can provide across all of London. And, using that in all the discussions that we have internally on kind of all the different other cross-cutting policy issues, so we can think about, whether that's the London plan or whether we're working with the transport team, where can we take some of these broader questions and either integrate green infrastructure, which would be great, or maybe we think green infrastructure is more important in this location than something else. So not a direct answer to your question, but we're equipping ourselves so that we can have those conversations and make the case where we think actually it's absolutely important that we have trees or greening or suds or something in this area, it might be worth an argument about that in terms of whether that's more important than car parking, but that's ultimately not up to me.
I'll go have that argument with them there. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So we've got choice of trees, availability of trees and tree care. I'm thinking that we are progressing very well. If everyone's comfortable, I'm going to continue and not have a break because... Is everyone happy with that? Okay. So in which case, I'm going to come to Assembly Member Bassam Mahfouz, who's going to start with the questions on choice of trees.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I should state, I think, first of all, representing Ealing, not only, of course, does the borough have an oak tree as its emblem ever since its inception, but actually, I think, Craig, your organisation, the London Tree Officers Association, is actually chaired by my arboricultural lead, Dale Mortimer, who I've known for a couple of decades, actually. And obviously, being Lebanese origin myself, I think one of the few tree flags in the world that has a national emblem of a tree on there as well. So, but look, I'm going to go into choice of trees, and we've heard quite a lot in terms of difficulty in the first 3 years of growth, 3 to 4 years of growth from Keith. You've all commented about drought stress. Pest and disease has come up time and time again in terms of choices. And when you look at the factors in terms of choosing trees, and I'll start with yourself, Craig, in terms of, obviously from a borough perspective, you're very often the sort of lead in terms of choosing those trees. You've got to balance out ease of growth, canopy cover, carbon reduction against things like leaf fall, high maintenance costs, damage to pavements, potential challenges from neighbours and so on. What factors do you take into consideration, and have they changed as a result of climate change?
I think there's factors that have always been considerations to site constraints, and that often leads to a first decision of whether or not you can plant a tree in a location at all in the first instance. We can look to introduce measures such as route directing barriers to attempt to minimise pavement disruption. You mentioned leaf fall. That's a common complaint from residents. However, again, it's about addressing that and understanding, well, explaining the benefits of trees, and actually these are part of a natural cycle, and actually shifting attitudes there. Factors that influence the species choice. Certainly information around suitability of future climates is coming into the conversation, but I don't know if that is broadly the key driver across London, and I think it should be. But there's other constraining factors. For example, what's the species availability within the nursery? What information is there available around species suitability in the future? I think that there needs to be planting strategies across every single London borough, and these need to be long-term strategies, and they need to be aimed at understanding baselines of what the existing canopy is, what the existing tree population is, what the vulnerabilities are, and how we can shift away from it being vulnerable to one that may be more resilient. And I think that there's probably a lack of that long-term strategy in place, and that's reflected in some of the documentation that's coming out of the London Urban Forest Partnership. So it's again, it's about establishing baselines of where we are and how we can get everybody on board and going in the same direction, and making sure that people are properly resourced to do so.
Thanks, Craig. Anybody else wanting to come in on this? Kevin?
Yeah, it's really interesting because what we don't see enough of, if we're to be honest, is species diversity within London. We get rows and rows of the same species. That's not building a resilient urban landscape. We have to be honest about that, and that's something we do need to address. And I do think I'm very fortunate. I get to do a lot of travelling with my job and go and visit different areas, and you do see in some of the most successful cities at doing this, there is a city-wide strategy, and everyone's working towards that strategy. With how the London boroughs are set up, that's very difficult to do, because different boroughs will have different priorities, they have different opinions on what should be planted, and also how we plant. You know, if we're truly going to invest into green infrastructure, we do have to start thinking about, we're going to have to spend a lot more resources on dealing with the soils first, creating that environment, and it's not just about trees. We need to start getting the shrubs in as well. You know, if we're truly to use green infrastructure to deal with some of these problems we're going to have, like stormwater, for instance, and we look at sud systems, you need to use a different species composition. You need to, again, fortunately, look at plants. From my expertise is from the steppe, because they're used to feast and famine when it comes to water. That's what they deal with. They've naturally adapted to that. But it's not just about that tree. It's about building in shrubs. When I've been in Tbilisi or I've been in Iași in Romania, what you do see is how the species compositions are planted. So they have vast amount of canopy cover. It doesn't matter what any green space, it has lots of canopy cover because they need the shade. But underneath that, they have the shrubs as well. And that's what we're not building enough into our urban landscapes in London. We're just trying to use trees. Trees are part of the solution, but for green infrastructure overall, we need to bring in these woody shrubs as well. So it's a really complex thing when we start looking at the availability, but how we start to plant these urban environments.
Thanks, Kevin. Just on that point, because obviously Craig was talking, there is very much an ambition to move to this, and we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We do need to move quickly on this and make sure that we're putting in place these measures. You talked about a citywide strategy that works well in other parts of the world. You referred to Tbilisi and Iași. Are there other examples of, or are they two examples of where that works well. There are other examples.
Yeah, one of the best examples that I've been lucky enough to visit recently and actually meet with the designers was in Malmö in Sweden. Now, what they've done there was an old industrial area. That industrial area has now been pedestrianised, and the planting that they're doing there is really thoughtful, to the point where they're changing the soils. They've created their own planting soil, but they're even bringing in areas where they're putting in sand, because they can grow the plants a lot better in sand, because you've got that free draining nature. It deals with the stormwater, and they're really working hard to get green wherever they can. And the city of Malmö is investing heavily in this, and it's guided by one department, and they're doing it citywide, and it's a fantastic thing to go and see for me as a tree person. But they're thinking hard, so they're even thinking about when trees come into leaf. So for instance, there's an area of seating, and they're putting late emerging leaf in trees like Indian bean tree, catalpa, by these benches, so they get the early spring sun, so people can enjoy the early spring sun. And because they come out into leaf later, they will then create the shade for the summer. So they're thinking of what they're planting and those species composition really deeply. I think that's the thing we need to try and catch on to in London.
Thanks, Kevin. Just super quickly, Craig, would there be any reluctance to a citywide strategy, you know, if it felt like it was being imposed by the GLA on London boroughs in terms of what types of trees, if that came with support package around it?
You mentioned it being an emergency, and I agree it is. And I think that without an immediate or perhaps radical ways of moving forward in terms of producing strategies, then we're not going to meet the demands of the emergency. So I'm not sure what mechanisms are in place. Obviously, you've got different boroughs, different administrations delivering on targets, local targets, producing their own strategies. So I don't know how that works practically, but I certainly think guidance around what a strategy should look like is important. But I also think health checks on local authorities to see whether or not those strategies are in place and if they are according with the guidance.
I think what we're talking about here is actually having not 33 strategies across London, but having one strategy, which
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so that's why I just say, obviously, amongst your members, would you see that as something that would be seen as positive, or would there be reluctance?
I think,
given there is an emergency, as you've agreed to.
Yeah. No, I understand. I'm struggling to understand whether or not that's possible for a strategy that pans London to be in effect in the different local authorities with different administrations. The reason I'm saying about guidance is I know that the local. The London Urban Forest Partnership is looking to produce and is producing guidance around long-term thinking and strategies. So, however it's delivered, yes, all the boroughs need to be doing the same thing. But I'm not sure how that can be practically delivered.
Thanks, Craig. Abby, I know you're dying to come in, and I also wanted to ask you if you could just add to what you're going to be answering on this area. Was Kevin talked about shrubs and suds. So I know obviously that's part of the wider strategy, but just to make sure that we're not missing that opportunity when we're funding and supporting the development of suds across London as well.
Just on that second question, actually, we're actually focusing so much, I think this is one of the actions in the plan, is to work on how we embed tree planting with some of our SUDS work better, especially in highways, which is a very difficult place to do that. So we're definitely thinking about that, and our wider green infrastructure work funds all sorts of things, including shrubs too. But just to go to that question about a London-wide plan, so in effect, the London Urban Forest Plan is a London-wide plan, with all the different partnerships, and some of the actions that are in that, which Craig mentioned, we are intending to do some guidance, especially following this climate resilience research to see if we can recommend species, best practices, all sorts of things. We're working with the L2A to understand what's useful, what's needed, what would be helpful in terms of that guidance. I think it'd be really difficult to get to the level of plan that places like Malmö have, because that's really operational, and the GLA doesn't have operational responsibilities, and all the different boroughs operate differently, and so how a strategy across all of London that's any kind of operationally deeper than the plan that we already have, I think would be difficult, because you'd have to get all the boroughs functioning either in a similar way, or it'd have to be complex enough to operate with all the different ways that the different boroughs work. And so, And then, of course, the lack of funding to be able to actually support that. So I mean, it's not a bad idea. It'd be really nice if we could do something like that. And I think we'll try to do the best that we can in terms of kind of guidance and what we do through the partnership. But I don't think functionally we have, or the GLA has enough kind of operational experience and responsibility to be able to do the sorts of things that, you know, Kevin has said is happening in other cities.
Thank you, Abby. And just finally on this particular topic, maybe Kevin and Kate, Kevin, you've referred to diversity of species as well, and obviously there are new choices of trees that boroughs would be looking at in terms of introducing into their boroughs as part of this. Is there a decent enough variety of new choices on the table in order to be able to achieve both that sort of resilience that we've been talking about and achieving those sorts of goals around carbon reduction, etc., canopy cover, alongside making sure that we've got the diversity?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So we do have a diversity of plants that we're working on research to understand what's available in the trade, to what could be planted and what is suitable. But it's like Keith spoke about earlier, and this is something that we have to all work together and be collaborative is how we get new provenance of these trees. The species are there, it's the provenance. They're not, we haven't always got the right seed source. And that is the biggest job for us in Botanic Gardens, but also for the nursery trade, to try and create a collaborative project or a way of working together to get this new resource in. Lots of red tape, it's quite complex because of things like Nagoya, which is a treaty that was to help protect biodiversity. So we have to really work together, and that's something we're working on. But we have to be extremely honest that some of these trees that we're identifying as suitable species are probably not going to be available truly in the trade for the next 10 to 15 years. That's the honest truth. And we can't hide from that. But what would be better if we do start thinking more deeply to what is available and where we should be planting it, and not just sticking silver birch in a footpath because it's an easy selection choice, because it's not going to thrive and it's not going to provide that ecosystem service. So there are things we can do, but there is still a lot to work on for the future.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kate, perhaps in terms of how it's influencing your choices of trees?
Yeah, I mean, we always we have our expertise on our team, but we would always work very closely with the landowner. We don't own any land ourselves, so we would always work very closely with the local authority or other landowner to ensure that we're selecting the right species. And we're not seeing any huge issues with availability of species at the moment, but there are species that we would like that aren't available yet, and I'm sure Keith can comment further on that, but it takes time to grow trees, you know, so that's that. I mean, just picking up briefly on you know, the work that Kevin's doing, and we're keen to, you know, this could be a really good opportunity to trial some of these species from different provenance and different sort of genetic diversity. So, you know, as part of our plans coming up, then we're looking at potentially, you know, trying to find sites. We've done a huge amount of work at Ealing as well, and working in Hillingdon and places like that, where we could look at some really exciting trials. Massive opportunity for education around climate and tree, you know, tree species for the public as well. So keen to push that work forward.
I mean, I think, you know, one of the reasons why we were keen to discuss this today is because, you know, we see the climate changing so quickly, and the issue of how long it takes to, you know, grow the trees in the first place, but also the fact that we're at these early stages, I think it would still be fair to say, of working out exactly which are the trees with that specific provenance, with those, you know, that part of their genome that's been turned on and that allows them to flourish in these the climate conditions that we see elsewhere, and therefore might flourish in London in 50 or 100 years' time. What we don't want is all the current trees all to die because the climate is changing so quickly before we're in a position where, you know, we've started understanding, identifying and then planting the trees that will be able to survive over the next 100, 200 years. So that's why we felt this meeting was really important. But I'm now going to pass on to my colleague, Assembly Member Thomas Turrell, who's going going to pick up the questioning around availability of trees, but wants to pick up some of the areas that we were just touching on there.
Thank you for that, Chair. I just wanted to start off actually with Kevin, with some of your remarks at the start of the meeting where you mentioned that London being 3% warmer than other urban islands and the impact that has on tree survival. So we all know that Londoners love their trees, and members of this committee who are also councillors will know that when a tree dies in a local area, there's always a rush to try to get it replaced. And as we mentioned, the councils don't always have the resource to do that. So I wanted to pick up around this tree survival and say that do you think that the planning system needs to be more robust in how it's considering the materials used in buildings about the survival of trees and how that and how that can impact local areas and the tree survival rates?
Yeah, of course. So with the planning, I think that's truly where we're going to have to tackle some of this, is at the planning, when developments are going through planning, is that need for green infrastructure, but also to make sure that there is a really what's the best way? That it's really structured in that they have to make sure that they're creating a good growing environment. I come from a commercial background. I can tell you now that on development sites, the last thing they're thinking about is protecting soils for tree planting. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. Trees are always the last port of call. I do lots of discussions with landscape architects, and they're coming in, the soil's already destroyed, and it's, you believe it or not, just driving construction traffic over the soil will damage it severely. That's why we're seeing now, especially in a lot of the European cities, that they're removing that soil and putting in a tree planting soil. So they're just removing the whole soil. And I do think we need to start building that in our planning process, is the establishment of green infrastructure. And I think it's not seen as important enough. It's all about the development and it's about the units. We need to try to think more positively for the green infrastructure, because that's what we're going to need into the future, and not just the drive for unit and unit space. And I think that's going to be the biggest thing. Unfortunately, you know, in the urban world, in the urban development, the worst thing ever created really was block paving, because everyone block paves their lawn, everyone block paves their drive. Now, as soon as you put block paving in, that's going to increase your urban heat island, because that's absorbing heat all day, radiates at night. We've lost our grass, we've lost our green area, and anything we can do within the planning process to increase green infrastructure area is going to be critically important as we move forward.
Thank you, Nick. So just following off on that, when the new London plan comes out later this year, do you want to see that include sections on how we can cool down London as an urban island?
Of course, it's essential, and that's one of the biggest things. I was lucky enough to talk in the House of Lords, and I was talking at the physicians, and they were talking about the urban heat stress, and there was 3,000 extra deaths through urban heat alone in 2022. So it is a significant thing, and we are seeing the elderly and the young, unfortunately, now starting to die because of the heat rises. So the green infrastructure is just one of those ways that we can deal with that. It's not the sole way, but it's one of the ways we can build in resilience.
Thank you for that. So, Craig, coming on to you now. How long does it normally take between ordering trees and delivery? And are there stocks of trees available? Or are they grown to order?
In terms of order to delivery, that's a fairly straightforward process, and we've got relationships with nurseries, and nurseries will have essentially here's what's available, and you can order from that and deliver for planting within that given season. Aside from that, in terms of growing on, future planning, yes, that can take place as well. We can form relationships with nurseries, have a more strategic and proactive approach towards knowing what your population needs to be, and therefore the nursery supports that. But going back to the point earlier around strategy and having a planting strategy in place, I think that's where it starts. You need to understand what your existing palette is, what you want your palette to be, and that's where the conversations with nurseries needs to start in developing that. So, and that's not just about species, again, I'd echo that's about provenance too. Because we need to find a balance for our existing native trees that we want to see a continuation of that characteristic in the landscape.
Thank you for that. And then going out to the committee, are you seeing a higher demand for trees that are more resilient to the effects of climate change? Front you.
Are we? Gradually, yes. But, and here's the but. I mean, Craig has intimated the lead time. So, for what you would present as a street tree, which is approximately 1.8 metre, 2 metre clear stem, 3.5 metres, 3 metres, that tree's between 7, and Kevin's quite, between 7 and 15 years old when it goes in ground, dependent on species. The chair was quite right, we can't just whip up trees. It can't be done. So what you get is a chicken and egg situation. So I, as a nursery, why am I going to invest in something that takes me 7 to 15 years to produce when funding fluctuates annually? So I might come in and plan my production for 7 to 10 years' time on a high in terms of funding. When my product's ready to go to market, I might be in a cycle of low funding. So there is no consistency. So it makes it very difficult to plan. Also, bringing new trees on, there's a gamble. So you introduce a new species or you introduce a new cultivar. Demand doesn't instantly arrive at the point where you're selling a significant part of your stock. So that can be a 2 or 3 year lead time before there's the acceptance of the new species or cultivar you brought onto the market. So that's a difficulty. The missing, or there's many missing factors, but probably the most significant one is the lack of strategic thinking. And I intimated it earlier on. It's this idea that we can think around urban forest management in either political terms or in human life. And we have to be thinking longer, and that seems to be the driving factor. With long-term sustained funding, and I stress sustained, long-term planning becomes possible. Craig's quite right. Scheduled planting programs, not 1 year, 5, 10 years. This is what we're going to do into the future. This is what we're going to do. Building into that then can become the introduction of new species. Because Craig, as a tree manager with a long-term plan in place, can say to me, in year 4, I want to introduce Coleroteria into my population. At that time, I will want 50 Coleroteria at this size. The nursery has a framework to grow to. There's a program in place. During that period of time, Craig can come and see the trees developing on the nursery and say, that's what I want. But again, that comes, that also is the consistency and sustained value of funding and taking out this cyclic dips, because it becomes impossible. So nurseries are a business, and the business succeeds or fails on the trees it sells. If we offer a pallet of, we've got 350 at Barcham or something like that. If we have a known pallet of trees, so we say 20 species and cultivars that sell out, we're going to continue to grow them. So that's why you see a plethora of Pyrus Chanticleer in London streets, because they sell.
What cannot be seen on the webcast is that when you said that, both Craig and Kevin were smiling a lot and were, laughing, I think it would be fair to say, at your comment. Do you want to just explain why what Keith referred to made you both react in that way, for the benefit of those who are tuning in?
Well, yeah, for me, it's my most hated tree, to be honest. That's why I laugh, because it's planted everywhere, especially in London. In most streets in London, you've got Pyrachanticare. It flowers, and that's it for about 2 weeks. It then makes a mess. It then drops a load of fruit, and everyone moans about it, and that's all it does. So, yeah, so what Keith is saying is right. So even for me at Kew, so when I look at the Arboretum and I'm looking at how we're going to manage I know I'm very lucky and I have the space to do this, but even within the tree collection at Kew, I'm thinking over the next 70 years. I'm not thinking in political 5-year terms. We can't. We need to create strategies that go over multiple governments, and these strategies now, especially with the climate and how fast it's shifting, they do need to be over 50 and 70 years. And they have to be dynamic, and we have to be able to adapt them, but the overall principles need to go a lot longer. And that will help Keith and the nursery trade to build in new species, because they know that over the next 50 years, the funding streams are going to be this, and these are the planting strategies that are going to come in from the boroughs. And that's truly how we have to start looking at this, and we've got to get away from this reactive. At the moment, all our tree planting strategies are reactive. There's no long-term strategy thinking, and that's the biggest thing that I've learned by doing the landscape succession plan and now the living landscape plan at Kew, is to look at that longer piece and look at that 70-year period. And we're not planting trees for us now, are we? We're planting for the next generation. And you think what the Victorians did for us. If the Victorians didn't plant those London planes, truly what shade trees would we have in London today? Because there isn't. And that's what we have to be honest about, and that's what we have to look at planting. And we've got to come away from just planting the small, easy trees to maintain. Pyrachanticare is so popular because it's an upright tree, it's a tight canopy, and you don't have to do a lot of maintenance on it. We need the big shade trees, and we need the small trees as well. We need this diverse urban landscape, and currently we're not getting that because of financial restraints for the local authorities because of maintenance. And that will come with a cultural shift as well. People are going to have to accept shade.
Thank you. I think that's been really helpful. Keith, sorry though, you were in full flight yourself.
On again.
Yeah.
Yeah. The strategic approach, I can't recommend or suggest. That seems to be, to me, the way forward. It has to be strategised at a high level. Nurseries can within a certain range, produce what is demanded or required. But it has to be an exchange. So long-term partnerships are to be recommended, where the recipient of the tree, the purchaser, let's say the GLA, has a long-term relationship with a nursery or nurseries. And then there's shared outcomes. So I think there's an awful lot of learning to do. We're going to find skills gaps in here, because if, as Kevin has intimated, we start using, which we've been very poor at doing, as using places like Kew as indicators not only of trees that within the collection that are going to potentially not be able to cope with climate change, but also as keys to what species might be useful in the urban environment. Because amongst the species at Kew, I know for a fact there are species now that are not currently available in the nursery trade, but have the potential to offer some of those characteristics we're looking for in terms of resilience in the tree population. So a little bit about resilience. Yes, it's commonly agreed that now resilience within the population is one of the agreed remedies, if remedy is the word I can use. But it's not just resilience it's not just diversity in terms of species. It's diversity in terms of size. It's diversity in terms of age. It's diversity in terms of distribution. All of these factors are part of the urban forest, if you like, matrix. And you can't do one without the other. We tend to, in my view, and this is why I'm so adverse to the numbers game, we're focusing on planting. It's an easy sell. It's virtuous. What does that do about the age profile within our tree population? What does that do about the genetic diversity within our population? Pyrus chanticleer, one of the things you didn't mention, Kevin, they're all genetically the same. They're all clonal selections. So if a little disease comes in and hits Pyrus chanticleer, it goes through the lot. There is no genetic resistance whatsoever. So what's the genetic diversity within our population? So all of those factors, I think I'll stop there. Because I've been known to talk all morning, so...
Well, sadly, we don't quite have all morning to enable that to happen, but thank you very much. That was really helpful. And we're now going to move back to Assembly Member Zach Polansky, who's going to come in with some further questions.
I think all my questions were answered, actually. That was quite extensive.
They have been fairly well answered, and I think the research into the potential tree varieties and how soon they may be in nurseries and commercially viable, the linkages with taking a more long-term view of how we plant and when we're planting for, I think are very well made points. So I'm going to move on to the area on tree care, and we're going to come back to Assembly Member Bassam Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. And go back to the point that Keith raised at the start, one of the challenges being those first few years of a new tree being planted. So I'm just going to be asking the panel in terms of what you feel are the biggest barriers to providing the aftercare that is needed in terms of making sure that newly planted trees have what they need to survive. I'll go back to Keith, but make sure that you don't have the final word. We can then pass it on to other people.
Wow, where do you start? Start off with a thing, you won't have to walk more than 500 metres from this building to see a badly planted tree. That's the reality. So we start from that. So what goes wrong? Kevin has mentioned soil volume, which is a solution or a remedy, but we have to be realistic. We can't say we're not going to develop, we're not going to rip up all of, I've said this before, but we're not going to rip up footpaths to put in new infrastructure for trees. It's not going to happen. So we're going to basically be retrofitting into existing space. What goes wrong? Okay. Poor quality nursery stock to start with, so your starter product is poor. You move on, you talk about your storage once that product has been delivered and how it's handled in that period in between the nursery and prior to planting. Then you've got planting techniques. So how are the trees planted? And the variables would, I think, surprise you in the quality of planting, quality of management and maintenance subsequent to planting. When you're next walking around the town, or walking around here, make a note of how many times you see a young tree where the tree is actually holding up the stake that put it in, or that the cage that was put round the tree to protect it is actually becoming part of the tree because the tree is growing into it, and so on and so forth. So management and maintenance. Management and maintenance is not, there's nothing sexy about management and maintenance. It's not an easy sell, but it's critical. We think, this is me, Trees and Design Action Group, and other colleagues, Arboricultural Association, we've identified it as a performance gap. When you look at the literature in the public domain around tree planting, it's copious. We could probably pile it up to the ceiling. So why, the question, why can I walk 500 metres from this building and see a badly planted tree? Why? There's a gap. So where's the performance gap? Where's the bit that says, why aren't we putting the copious amounts of theory into practice? Because tree planting is actually really simple. You dig a hole, you put the tree in, it'll grow. What's missing, certainly with maintenance-wise, mulch has been mentioned. Mulch is proving critical. I would ask why a volunteer group in Sussex, using volunteers all in their 70s to plant trees, can hit a 90%, 98% success rate following planting over a period of time. And the missing word's care. How do we introduce care into our system? Because the contractor that plants the trees invariably don't care. They walk away. They've been paid, job done, off they've gone. So how do we introduce care into the system? Then we move on to outcomes. Surely we've got to move away from the suggestion that it's planting that's important. No, it's not. The important element is outcome, establishment. The point, we did a British standard several years back now, and we called it trees, from nursery to independence in the landscape. The independence in the landscape is the critical element. So we evaluate our tree planting by the numbers we've put in the ground, and we say, haven't we done well? We're not terribly good at assessing the outcomes from our numbers we've put in the ground. So again, one of the things that surprises me, and like Kevin, my position has enabled me to travel widely and look at other systems and look at other... I'm always staggered with the amount of public money that's put into tree planting, with amounts of money set aside for watering and maintenance for a known period of time, that within that grant system there isn't the requirement for an independent audit at the end of the period, so we know what the outcomes are, whether public money has been spent effectively or otherwise, and learn from the mistakes. So an independent would allow us to look at things we've got wrong, modify practice, identify species that are just not going to do well, but also perhaps I want the species that will do very well. So, as I said, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk for some part of the morning. Anyway, I'll shut.
Thanks, Keith, for shedding light on that. Pretty comprehensive there, and I know colleagues will follow up on the aspects in terms of particularly the contractors' responsibility and follow through, but also in terms of that community growth support. So trying not to touch on those two points, would anybody else like to come in on this particular topic? Kate?
So we're not allowed to talk about the community points, because that's what I'm desperate to talk about.
Yeah, you're going to have a chance.
No, we're going to come to that at the
just to save that for yeah. So without necessarily touching at this particular point, and Craig, I appreciate you're going to talk about your contractor's role, but I know that my colleague Joe is going to be asking you about that. So, but if anybody didn't want to touch on those two particular points, if there was anything else that people wanted to add to what Keith's already contributed. No. Oh, sorry, go on, Craig. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I can talk about contractors, so I will do in a moment. But I think it goes back to the point of strategy. I think it's the emphasis and importance that's being placed on tree planting and aftercare at a local level. If you've resourced that properly, you can have a tree planting officer in place. You can have a strategy form out of that. You can challenge the attitudes of contractors that are doing the work. You can foster links with the community to bring them on board as part of that growth plan of the trees within the landscape. The key thing is a strategic approach, but also the funding side of things as well. There does need to be the funding in place to support. But I also think there needs to be, and this does link to your point, there needs to be that relationship with the community where we're working together. Because if we don't work together, we might get our trees to establish. We're not going to get them to thrive. We're not going to achieve the aims of the British standard that Keith's been referring to if we don't do it collectively.
Okay, I'll leave it there and pass on to my colleagues.
Thanks very much. So we're going to move on to Assembly Member Joanne McCartney, who's going to talk further about tree care.
Thank you, and I can show you a badly planted tree in my street if anyone wants to come and visit. But I want to ask about the trees we have at the moment, and this is primarily for you, Craig, but if anybody else wants to come in, please do. I mean, what opportunities and challenges are there currently facing you with your tree management strategies? And I'm particularly interested because it has, it always makes the papers when local authorities want to take out a tree, and quite often residents are opposed. Tree's been there a long time, and local authorities always cite insurance companies' demands that they have to, otherwise they will not insure any damage to nearby properties. So I'm interested in what the challenges you have with maintaining your current tree stock, and if you could address the insurance point as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my own personal experience, I'm lucky enough in many ways to work in an area where we don't suffer from a great degree of tree-related subsidence. But I know in other parts of London, that's a major factor in how trees are managed. And what that ends up looking like is trees on regular regimes of pruning or pollarding that people quite often term it as, but repollarding. And quite often that can be rather severe, and that is another factor that comes into play when we're considering the effect of climate change and other abiotic factors that are in effect. And Keith, you mentioned that earlier. It's not just one thing, it's a combination of factors. And something I advise officers that are making recommendations on trees is that do you want to be one of these factors? You know, that's the thing, is that we can all act, we can all be part of the problem. Or if we change why we're managing our trees to a more forward-looking approach, I think you could have much better outcomes. And I think that you asked about opportunities. I think, again, bringing it back to that baseline of what's your population made up of? What are the vulnerabilities there? How does that guide how you're managing those trees? What other factors come into play? Insurance and subsidence, yeah, that is a factor, unfortunately, and that's a subject that needs to be explored on its own. It's only going to get worse, and you could end up in a situation like this where we just keep seeing a downward trend where it's anti-tree, and that's about attitudes and education and value, how we value trees. Fortunately, we've got mechanisms in place to value trees, and you can offset that against the value of a claim, for example. But then that calls into question, well, are we valuing our trees correctly still? So there's a number of questions there. But in my own experience, yes, I think there's an opportunity to look at what we have and how do we adapt our management of these trees to be more forward-looking and safeguarding future generations. A lot of our tree management is based upon established practice over the last half a century. And I think, actually, to go to the point, is one of the factors around the tree planting and how contractors may deliver tree planting. I think the standard of planting is often an indicator of how well that authority is operating with the contractor, and that's where the future is. It's in proper care. It's not in just continuing to do what we've done before.
Thank you. I understand that.
Could I offer you just a little thought that goes on, because and it's something that may surprise you. We did the first eye-tree study in this country was carried out in Torbay. We calculated the number of trees and a lot of other factors. But it's the number of trees. For the first time, we actually went back and did a second study at Torbay. There were fewer trees, but canopy cover had gone up. So the question is why? They were investing more of their annual budget in maintaining the significant trees as opposed to focusing on planting. And I was very sort of, because it surprised us when it came in. You've got fewer trees, but canopy cover is greater. And I think that part of the argument is often lost. So, sorry.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, certainly in Haringey, we've had many instances lately where healthy trees have been cut down because insurance companies have, in effect, demanded it. And I think councils are in a rock and a hard place on this. So I just wondered whether anyone had got any views on this, or whether more work needs to be done or pressure applied onto insurance companies.
Well, yeah. So this is so if we're to be honest, if the current climate patterns carry on and we know that these temperatures are going to increase, your water demand on that soil is going to increase. You are going to see an increase in subsidence claims just because of the soil composition being the London clay. Now, at what point do we still allow the insurance companies to dictate taking that tree out? Because that tree, providing the ecosystem service, is going to be worth a hell of a lot more over the next 70 years than it will be to underpin a house. And they're the things that we have to start pushing back on. Because even when I was doing commercial tree surgery 15 years ago, we used to remove a hell of a lot of trees for houses with subsidence. Now, 9 times out of 10, those trees probably didn't need to be removed, and often you will get the adverse effects of heave. So when the soil then rehydrates in the winter, and that's what we're going to have to get used to. And the insurance companies are going to have to start thinking and working with engineers to find solutions, because our water table is going to go shift up and down significantly, because we're in drought now. But if we're in the autumn, we could potentially have 8 weeks of rain, because that's where our weather pattern's going. So a lot of our rainfall is going to come in the autumn and winter. Therefore, that soil will then rehydrate, and then you will get a heave in the property. So we need to start putting a lot more pressure on the mortgage and the insurance companies to try and protect these trees, rather than just using tree removal as an easy solution to that subsidence claim. And I think that needs to come from pressure, especially from the planning part of the planning side of government, but it does need to be addressed, because the current way it works isn't sustainable.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any comments? Yeah, Craig.
Yeah, I would just add that the London Tree Officer Association is working closely with organisations to produce guidance on proper management of cases where subsidence is being alleged. And something I think is important to note is that quite often spurious claims are received with inadequate detail. And I think yes. But I think the key thing is to ensure that there's proper checks in place to ensure that we're pushing back against those spurious claims, and actually that they're challenged as well, that the insurance companies that are coming forward with minimal detail in order to try and negotiate a tree removal, sometimes offering, a certain amount of money for that to happen, it's unacceptable. It should be rejected.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I can go any further, but I think,
I can see that Assemblymember Mahfouz wants to come in briefly on this.
Just very, very quickly, Craig. So, I mean, we heard earlier about, obviously, Keith's point about the standard in terms of longevity. A number of council contracts move from being input-based to being outcome-based. So are there opportunities for local authorities to, when they go to contract out, because obviously much of the work that you do in terms of maintenance of the trees is contracted out to third parties, where you can have longer-term contracts where actually the survival of that tree is built into the contract more than just the lopping and other sort of day-to-day maintenance is involved?
Absolutely. I think the key thing is when you're embarking upon these contracts is that you make sure that you've got KPIs in place in the right areas. And you can have lists of KPIs and to the point where they become meaningless. But I think that if you've got strong, robust KPIs against tree aftercare, tree planting aftercare, and that's resourced. For example, you've got a tree planting officer in place that is responsible for tethering that contractor to those KPIs, making sure the performance is right, then it should work. It should work. It's just a matter of resourcing it and making sure that there's that relationship with the contractor where they understand that tree planting and aftercare is taken very, very seriously.
And just again, super quickly, is, across the LTOA, do you see that being integrated into the contracts, and is that something that's already happening, or does that need to move at a quicker pace?
KPIs in contracts are commonplace. I think that obviously is tree planting.
Sorry, it's those specific types of KPIs. Yeah.
I couldn't answer for every single authority, but it would surprise me if KPIs weren't being included against tree planting and aftercare.
Just on this point about contracts and contractors, we do see, and this is why I slightly don't agree with Abby, the idea that there are 32 different approaches plus the City of London going on, because we're now finding that we've got the same contractors, I think, operating in many different places. I'm not going to do a roll call of the contractors, but you'll know who I'm talking about. So surely if we're asking for something to go into the prelims or into the outputs or the outcomes for a contractor in Borough X, then surely boroughs Y and Z can ask for the same thing fairly easily, and the contractors should be able to comply.
Absolutely. But again, I'll go back to the question of resources. You might find one borough which has got a healthy population of trees and tree officers and strategies in place to help support everything, and that relationship with the contractor that's all in place. You may find another borough where they don't have those things in place, and there's a disparity sometimes in resources, and unfortunately if you don't have those resources in place, it's very difficult to support the contractor and the aims that you're trying to achieve.
Yes, I've had that conversation with ecologists and biodiversity officers. Some boroughs have a biologist or a biodiversity officer, an ecologist, who will inform decisions being made about planning applications, and others have somebody who might be working in that role but is in a completely different department. So it seems to be very patchy, I think it would be fair to say.
I would also add that I think if you can build upon what I was saying there, if you've got a healthy base to start from, then actually there's community involvement, and that community involvement doesn't just look like connecting with trees in the landscape and being part of their life cycle, their establishment, their thriving in the landscape, but why not have them involved in then looking at what the contractors are doing, reporting back to the local authorities. But this takes investment.
So you bring me back to the question that I was going to focus on, which is why Assemblymember Mahfouz was saying don't focus too much on communities. And I just want to ask all of you, actually, and I will start with Kevin, what can we do to really make sure that you were saying we need to keep people inspired, focused on trees, understanding what they can do to help trees. What can we do to really involve local communities? Is it visits to Kew to see what you're doing there? Should that be encouraged for all local schools? I certainly know when we were trying to encourage children to understand the difference between throwing waste away and recycling, that lots of trips to see recycling centres and things like that have happened. Is that something that we should be doing even more of?
Yeah, I do agree. Like, we have to look at the next generation. So we do need to look at how we look at our nature around us in schools. So it's quite interesting. For National Science Week, I did a couple of talks in local schools. And it's quite amazing how engaged the children got when we start to take time showing them air pots, showing them how trees grow and why they're important. But that's not part of mainstream education, and that's what's quite worrying. When they talk about climate change, it's often about the Amazon, and it's not about the environment around us. And that is something I keep trying to get in and talk to people in education to try and get more of that. And I do think that's where we're missing. We are missing that local. Everyone's starting to think that climate change is something that's happening in the Amazon rainforest. They're not thinking about it's happening on their own doorstep. And I do think anything we can do in the communication piece with the general public that this is happening around us. So at Kew, this year we've got a festival on trees, and it's talking about the vulnerability and how climate change is local. We've got a tree that unfortunately died in 2022 from the drought, and we've got some interpretation around that, and we're building around that because Richard Deverill, the director, wanted visitors to the garden to understand that climate change is now and it's happening locally. And I think anything that we can do to improve that communication is going to be incredibly important to change culture. As we were talking about earlier about car park and the demand for cars and our roads, we're going to have to start changing and have more pedestrianised areas with more green infrastructure in. If you look at the project for Oxford Street, if you look at that to be pedestrianised and the plans that I've seen from different landscape architects they're the sort of things we're going to have to seriously start thinking about. But it's getting the public on board and really doing that communication piece, why they're so important. And we can't do it on our own. It needs to be led by government as well to make this a really important need to explain why and what's happening around us and the biodiversity loss. We hear about the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees. That comes up and down in the news every now and then when there's a quiet news week, but that's not pushed enough to the general public to really understand the effect that's going to have on biodiversity loss. And I do think we all need to work together on this to push this, experts as well as government.
Thank you. Keith, do you think, as well as involving, I don't know, more visits to Kew, should we be encouraging, I don't know, school parties to come and see baby trees being grown in commercial nurseries and having some sort of interface there so that people understand the length of time? Because I think, you know, we're very much now a generation of, you know, if you can't see it in 3 minutes on a TikTok video, then it's old. Well, okay. 30 seconds in a TikTok video, you know, it's too long, isn't it? If it's not on Instagram, you know, it's not worth looking at.
That seemed like a very subtle way of telling me not to give you a long answer.
No, not at all.
30 seconds start.
Yeah, that's it. Look, one of the things that has come out of the almost worldwide series of iTree studies on urban forest composition and structure, in that the ratio varies between 60 and 75% of the urban forest is in people's back gardens.
Yeah.
So we tend to, and the iTree study that was done in London, the most common tree in London was, everybody goes to London Plain, or it was apple, because of people's back gardens. So we don't engage, we don't tell people how important the space they manages. And then we don't promote people like Kate's organisation that are actually out there working with the folks and enthusing the folks. There's no sustained approach. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not going to be, well, I'm going to be critical. I think our tree warden network is tokenistic. It's badly resourced, it's not fully supported. I think there is, you learn from little examples. London Borough of Hackney. The tree manager there at the time wanted to engage with the community, so he set up a scheme of engagement. Did something very, very simple. Anybody that came forward to be a tree, whatever he called it, I can't remember, he gave them a watering can with the London Borough's name on. The engagement level he got from that very simple one action in terms of encouraging somebody to buy in to the situation was brilliant. Bristol did the same thing with water butts. They actually produced a logo that was the... So, I mean, Kate's in a far better position to offer you... my experience with community groups is that we don't support them. A community group wants to spend the money it has on planting trees. It doesn't want to spend the money on tree consultants to give them the advice they need. We don't make the conduits available to those community groups whereby they can easily get the professional advice they need and spend their resource on tree planting. I'm quite happy to hand over to Kate now because this
I'm going to be coming to Kate and Craig and also to Abby at the end. But before I do that, I think we've just been joined by Year 5 students from the Richard Albion Primary School in Barking and Dagenham. So can everyone give them a wave?
Hello.
They're waving back, so I think I've identified the right school. We are talking about trees, and we're just hearing what local communities and also people from schools can do to help trees survive and grow and thrive in London streets, parks and all over the place. So I'm going to come to Craig and then Kate and then Abby. But Craig, we're just talking about, you know, how local communities can get more involved in tree care, whether that be watering, whether that be mulching. I certainly know in Amsterdam they actually give out from the city authority stuff for people to put into their window boxes, and I think they also encourage them to do watering. Amsterdam being quite otherwise a dark place with very tall houses, and so they try to encourage a bit of mostly geraniums, it would seem, into window boxes. But what can we encourage people to do? How can we really get people involved in caring for the trees that surround them, whether it be in their back garden or anywhere else?
It is about engagement, and whether that's at a local or London-wide level. I think it's about establishing what the understanding is of trees, the role they play, what the appetite is for trees as well. We've done some local studies recently, and the response to that is overwhelmingly that the majority of people are in support of trees, and they would seek to be engaged in tree care activities. I think there's huge potential for the community to become involved in the aftercare side of things, but also citizen science, understanding how our trees are being affected. If we can educate around concerns, and you have certain action groups perhaps amongst your residents who are conducting citizen science projects on a particular issue, for example, ash dieback, something like that. If you wanted to understand the state of your population of ash, well, that would be really helpful, really useful. I think that the key thing is understanding and educating around the importance of trees as an adaptation, that the role they'll play in us adapting, how they'll take care of us in the future. But I also think that there is an opportunity to span different areas of need within our population. For example, watering a tree is quite a mindful exercise. And you mentioned it earlier, we want things instantly, and we suffer because lots of other people want things instantly. But actually, I know this from experience of watering the trees in my street. If it's on my to-do list, I'll take the watering can. The process of filling that can up, walking down the street, watering that tree, that's all I'm focused on. And that's really good for me. It takes me away from the stresses, and it'd be good for anybody who does it.
Takes you away from TikTok.
Well, I'm not.
Okay,
something
Instagram.
like that. But so that's the beginning of the journey, and I think there's a journey to take people on. So that's part of it. Then you form a connection with the tree. You've been part of that tree's progress in the landscape, and therefore you've got a connection with your place and a sense of place. If somebody else is doing that, well, then you've got a connection with somebody else in the community. So you're forming connections, and I think that's what trees can do. And that is a really positive way to engage with people, bring them into that collective care for trees, and take us away from a place where it may be seen that, well, you planted it, you water it. It's not as simple as that, and that won't work, So I think if I'm answering the question, there's plenty that can be done. I think it's about how we engage and how we get people on board.
One thing I have noticed is that people have become engaged in putting some soil around the base of a tree and then putting some flowers in. That has been quite a popular thing. Certainly some of my neighbours have done it, and I see it in various places. Do you think that helps? Because obviously the flowers also need the water, and if you're going to have a decent show of blooms, and people may overlook watering the tree, but they might remember to water the flowers. Do you think that can help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen it locally in that people have done it, and sometimes actually it causes a problem with the highway because you can then have the footways being covered in whatever's been planted. But as long as there's an understanding, rules and guidance in place about what's appropriate, it focuses the attention on that site. It does bring people out to water the trees. So I think that water their plants, but also the tree as well. So I think that certainly encourages people to do so. But just to touch on what Keith said earlier, yes, there is a network of tree warden schemes out there, varying success in different places. I'm involved in the formation of a scheme now, which it's looking to engage networks of community in watering trees and talking to each other about aftercare. So I think that there's opportunities that exist. I think we do need to understand where it's gone wrong in the past. And again, I know I keep talking about resourcing, but if you've got the basics in place, then you can support that community. If you don't have the resources in place, then you're not able to support that community, and there's a potential for conflict there and resentment, and then the whole thing falls flat.
Kate, I'm going to come to you next, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about this. So we've moved from how do we involve school children? Should they be visiting nurseries? Should they be going to Kew and other locations? Should we be handing out watering cans? How do we really get local communities involved in caring for the trees that they live amongst?
Yeah, so everyone wants to go and visit Kew. It's beautiful, but what we really need, and the barriers that we see, that people want to do something, but they don't know what to do, and they don't know where to do it or how to do it. So a lot of the work that we do is about giving people permission to act and opportunities. So it's about taking care of that everyday, ordinary nature. Whilst we've also got beautiful places like Kew to go and visit, it's really having the trees and nature on our doorsteps that is so important to us and our organisation. So we do lots of work in schools. We do lots of tree planting in schools. You can quietly put your hands up if you've got trees in your school playground. It'd be nice to know if you have. Yeah. Okay. Good. That's good to see. So I think really, it's about engaging young people, particularly our future tree guardians. Yes, we do have a tree warden scheme. The Tree Council run that. By their own admission, a lot of the tree wardens are in more rural areas, and they tend to be older, retired people. So I think there's a huge gap in building younger people's skills and knowledge around trees. So we increasingly see that young people are particularly anxious about climate change, anxious about their futures, but they're not going into the urban forest sector or the green sector. They're not pursuing environmental jobs. There's a massive disconnection there. Why is that happening? Why are they worried about it but not pursuing it? So there's a huge amount that we can do, and I think it's around giving people, signposting people to opportunities, giving them those skills and knowledge so that they can actually do something and make tangible change in their environment. And that is so empowering to be able to do that. One thing we haven't spoken about is around tree equity is the term, so around more targeted planting. So yes, completely agree that there's no point in planting trees if we're not caring for them. And I know this is about tree care, but in terms of linking to climate change, those poorer areas essentially are often struggling much more with lack of tree cover, and the associated heat and other problems that goes with it. So, a programme around targeted planting, where you're then engaging people who aren't typically becoming tree wardens or aren't coming forward and facing more barriers to connect with their environment, is absolutely vital. So a lot of the work that we do is around planting in estates and schools and on streets as well. So in some of those poorer areas, I'm just looking at the stats. I think, looking at our stats, around 86% of the projects that we planted last year were in areas of low tree canopy cover, in the top 40% most deprived in London. So, and that work is so vital, and it's underfunded. And like Keith and others have been saying, it's the planting that is the funded bit, and it's so difficult to get funding for the maintenance. So, and then the final piece is the Trees for Streets. We do run a Trees for Streets scheme, which is actually quite a difficult space to engage the community in, for obvious reasons: health and safety, size of the tree that you're planting. Trees for Streets is a great scheme whereby people can actually sponsor a tree, so it helps to unlock some private finance as well, which I'm sure pricks up ears of politicians, because it's essential to get that additional resource in. But that goes towards the planting and the aftercare of those trees, and it also engages people with trees on their streets. And then you get the social capital piece that Craig was talking about, where you get neighbours coming in talking, and it takes away the pressure of going round to each other's flats or houses, and that might feel a bit artificial. But you meet out on the street and you water a tree together, and instantly you've got some connection with the tree and with each other as well. So there's a huge amount that we can do. We just need some creativity and some innovation in this space. And digital, things can happen digitally as well. So we talked earlier about tracking tree loss, but that can be done via an app. That can appeal to younger people. I could go on. There's a huge amount that we could do, and we're really keen to do. So, yeah, if we can get that onto the Mayor's agenda, that would be wonderful.
Thanks very much, Kate. And finally, Abby, is there anything that you would like to add to what the others have said? What guidance can the GLA give in terms of how we involve local communities? Are we making enough suggestions and involving people enough?
Yeah, I actually have lots to share on this. I think this is quite an exciting space, and it's a direction. Bye, buddy. Sorry, the students are leaving. That's what I'm stopping for. But I think it's one of the key pivots in the updated action plan for the London Urban Forest Plan was more focus on this equity, collaboration, and a lot more kind of actions in this space. And I think some of it's learning from what's happened before. So I thought I'd share, we had kind of we had three big projects through the Trees Call to Action Fund delivery that were really successful. So we had, between those three programs, 66,500 people got involved in those projects, 26,000 of which were children and young people. And around 7,000 Londoners took part in one of the kind of community events that was involved in that. And so those were three things. Communities Blossoms, led by Street Trees for Living, with 44 schools and 2 NHS sites. And they had, through their tree guardianship program, a 95% survival rate in the trees that they planted. Trees for Cities had their Generation Tree program, so with a focus on ethnic diversity and 16 to 25-year-olds. And then TCV also had their urban forest community volunteers, around 949 people who were using this woodland condition self-assessment tool that was created through the TCAF program too, so allowing people to go out and actually assess woodlands. So a lot of success from that kind of first round of delivery, and so we want to build on that for this kind of next round. So there's several actions in this space as well. So more on the kind of urban forest community volunteers, more on kind of school engagement, more on citizen and community science projects, including kind of this kind of monitoring approach. We're also exploring the role of kind of user-friendly maps, kind of going back to the discussion earlier, what could be done with using those, making them more accessible. And then we ourselves, within our Trees for London program here at City Hall, we had a really successful program, the Trees for Young Londoners. That was built off of a program run by the youth team at the GLA, where they were, asked quite broadly what were the things that youth were interested in, what they thought funding should go into, and trees was one of the things there. So we developed this as a collaborative program between them. And we worked in partnership with the Tree Council and Action for Conservation to do this at schools. So we had 290 trees, this was in the pilot, 290 trees at 18 schools, and then overall we had 4,000 trees in 38 schools across 19 boroughs. And so just some really exciting stuff, and I think the intention is to build on that through our kind of next steps of work. I thought I'd mention too, just a couple months ago, a GCSE program on natural history got, I think, adopted. And so I don't know how much that goes into trees, but I think that idea of bringing it into school curriculums is something that's being talked about. That's not specific to London, but that's wider. And I think I can't say too much about it, but in the development of the new Green Roots funding program that we have is kind of thinking more widely at the types of things that we can fund, including these types of programs, and especially where they can be rolled out in kind of a bigger way. I think those are things that should be able to be eligible in the funding. So not just the tree planting element, but some of this kind of engagement and volunteer and community engagement elements too. But I do think, just kind of going back to the point that Craig keeps mentioning is that, there are boroughs that do this really, really well, and those are often the ones that have the resource or even just like the headspace to think about engagement in a meaningful and strategic way. So there are lots of good examples, but it's not consistent for everybody, and not everyone has the kind of expertise or capacity to do that. So looking into supporting capacity across just not only boroughs, but other kind of land managers in this space is another of the key actions in the Urban Forest Plan. I'm not sure we know yet what that looks like and how best to do that, but, sharing best practices and guidance, trying to help figure out how there are ways to get funding for this sort of thing, how folks can create networks so that community groups can interact with each other. I think these are all sorts of things on the table and that are really of interest to us.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to actually thank all of our guests for coming along today and answering all of our questions. We have reached the end of this session. However, we are ourselves going to undertake a visit to Kew, which we're looking forward to at the end of June, so that we have a better understanding. So obviously sitting in this room, there are not many trees in it, and so we will have a much better understanding of what is being done at Kew and the research that's being carried out there, including obviously items, trees that are being brought back from a wide variety of locations abroad in completely different climatic conditions. So we're really looking forward to that. We will also be at our next meeting, we hope, talking about the London Nature Recovery Strategy, and we obviously see trees as being an important part of that as well. We have now a few items of business to attend to, which you're very welcome to stay for. It won't actually take very long. If you need to get away, please feel free to leave now. But I'm now going to ask the committee if you're happy to note the report that we received in advance of this meeting and the discussion that we've just held. Is that noted? Thank you. Would you also delegate authority to me as the chair of the committee, in consultation with the party group lead members, to agree any outputs arising from today's discussions?
Yep, agreed.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the Environment Committee Work Programme, which is on pages 125 to 128 of your agenda pack. Can I ask you to note our work programme and note the meeting dates which were agreed by the London Assembly at the annual meeting on the 6th of May? Thank you. The date of our next meeting, which I've just referred to, is scheduled for the 12th of June at 2 p.m. in the Chamber. And there is no business that I consider to be urgent that needs to be done today. So thank you very much. I declare this meeting closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.